Okay. Can we start, Nikki?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening to everyone. This is Contacts and Continuities, 500 Years of Asian-Iberian Encounters, an international conference online hosted by the Ateneo de Manila University in collaboration with CHAM, Centro de Humanidades, Universidade Nueva de Lisboa, and the National Centennial Committee of the Republic of the Philippines. It is now 7 p.m. Philippine local time. Good evening from Manila. Good afternoon to our friends in Spain and Portugal. And good morning to Leia and friends in the United States. We are live streaming on the conference's YouTube channel and the National Centennial Committee's Facebook page. And also in our Zoom room and on social media. Okay, next slide, please. The Department of History is happy to host today's panel on government institutions. I am Maynardo Mendoza from the Department of History, and I will be your moderator for this evening's program. I will be assisted by Dr. Noel Rodriguez, our former chair, and Dr. Nikki Carci Cruz, who will be our community managers for this session. They will help me gather and line up questions for the question and answer, as well as take questions from within the Zoom room and from our audiences via live stream on YouTube and Facebook. Okay, next slide, please. This is the 11th panel in the month-long conference series and the second panel of part 3, which is on legacies of the encounter in institutions. Yesterday, we heard the opening keynote of Professor Vince Rafael and panel 10 on institutions from the Middle Ages onwards. Today, we continue the conversation. Okay, next slide, please. Allow me to give you an idea about our program for this evening. Today, we will hear the presentation of 3 speakers. Our first 2 speakers both sent their recorded presentations, and we will play the videos made by Eduardo Frutoso and Lola Elizalde, while our third speaker, Leia Castaneda, will present her paper live, and we will have a question and answer right after. Let me introduce our first speaker. Eduardo Jorge Miranda Frutoso has a degree in history from the Faculdade de Ciencias Sociais e Humanas de Universidade Nova de Lisboa and a specialization in Asian Studies from the Faculdade de Letras da Universidade do Porto. He has published several studies, both as co-author and co-author, among which are O Arbitraismo Ibérico entre Macau e Manila, População, Comercio e Finanzas in 2014, Naufragios e Otras Perdas da Carreira de India, Século XVI e XVII in 1998, O Movimento do Porto de Lisboa, o Comércio Luso Brasileiro, 1769 to 1836 in 2001, and Armadas de India, 1497 to 1835 in 2002. He worked at the Grupo de Trabalho del Ministerio de Educação para as comemorações dos descobrimentos portugueses and in the regional structure of the Ministry of Education. He is currently a secondary school teacher. Let me introduce you to the next speaker, Dr. Maria Dolores Elizalde. Maria Dolores Elizalde is scientific researcher at the Institute of History, Spanish National Research Council, or CSIC, in Madrid, Spain. She specializes in international history, colonial societies, and colonial and post-colonial processes in Asia and the Pacific in the 19th century, with a particular interest on the Philippines. Among her latest publications are Filipinas, Siglo XIX, Coexistencia e Interacción entre Comunidades en el Imperio Español in 2017, edited with Javier Huetz de Lemps, and Los Rojas, Filipinas en el Siglo XIX, a través de una familia hispano-filipina in 2020. Our third speaker is none other than Leia Castaneda Anastasio. Leia Castaneda Anastasio is graduated from the Ateneo University with a degree in AB Interdisciplinary Studies, where she's summa cum laude and departmental awardee. And after that, she went to the Ateneo Law School, where she graduated salutatorian and second honor silver medal and gold medal for best thesis. Selected as one of the 10 outstanding students of the Philippines in the field of law, Leia placed first in the 1993 Philippine Bar Examinations, then received her Masters of Law and Doctor of Juridical Science from Harvard Law School, becoming the first Filipino woman to earn the latter degree. Previously as a visiting scholar with Harvard Law School's East Asian Legal Studies program and Dartmouth College History Department, and a fellow with the Hearst Summer Institute in Legal History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Leia was awarded Harvard Law School's Yong Kim 1995 Memorial Prize in 2008 and the American Society of Legal History's William Nelson Cromwell Foundation Dissertation Prize in 2010. She is the author of the foundations of Modern Philippine State, Imperial Rule, and American Constitutional Tradition in the Philippine Islands, 1898 to 1935, published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. Okay, so we now, next slide, please. So we now invite members of the audience here in the Zoom meeting to either type their questions in the chat box or raise your hands or during the open forum. Drs. Noel Rodriguez and Drs. And Cruz will relay it to us. Okay, so we can, I think, start with the first presentation.
So this will be played by Vince and his team, the presentation of Eduardo Frutoso. This was pre-recorded.
I start by greeting all participants in this conference, both who are part of this panel and those who are attending the works, and thank the organization for the kind invitation to present my work. My intervention, which is necessarily short, intends to present the vision of two men who lived in Macau and the Philippines in the first half of the 17th century on how Portugal and Spain should act to better face the economic constraints of their Asian territories in a period of great instability and multiple threats to its own survival. The writings they performed are part of a general movement of writing texts generally directed at monarchs, with suggestions for the different types of problems faced by states, which we call arbitraism. This movement began in Spain in the late 16th century, but quickly spread to Portugal. The arbitrists whose thought I analyze here are Jorge Pinto de Azevedo and Hernando de los Rios Coronel. Pinto de Azevedo was living in Macau when, in 1646, he wrote his texts, which he addressed to the Portuguese king, entitled, and let me simplify, Very Important Warnings Addressed to King João IV. It is important to remember that the author wrote 6 years after the recovery of Portuguese independence, after a period of 60 years of Spanish rule. We are, therefore, in a context of war between Portugal and Spain as a result of this process. The texts written by Rios Coronel that I used in this study are earlier, dating from 1597, 1618, and 1621, in the context of Iberian Union, in which the kings of Spain were simultaneously the holders of the Portuguese crown. The first writing is entitled Memorial addressed to the king from Manila. The second is untitled, being part of a miscellany of Seville's Arquivo General de Indias. And the third is called Memorial and Report to His Majesty of the Attorney General of the Philippines on what needs to be remedied and the wealth that exists in them and in the Maluku Islands. Let's start with Jorge Pinto de Azevedo. He is a man with vast experience of contact with the Asian world. For 24 years, he roamed the Orient, serving the state as a soldier and captain, and also doing business on his own. This experience legitimizes, in his view, the presentation of this arbitrio, which he considers an asset for the definition of adequate policies with regard to the Portuguese state of India. Starting with the diagnosis of Portugal power in Asia, he states that the first big mistake of the Portuguese was to establish the seat of their power on the west coast of India. This is a region with a lot of piracy, which obliges the Portuguese authorities to make a permanent military effort and hide expenses to face the problem. On the other hand, there are no precious metals there. The local inhabitants produce everything for their consumption, uh, not depending on foreign trade, and even machinery work is difficult there due to the fact that most of the inhabitants are Muslims. However, at Pinto de Azevedo, the blame for this situation should not be attributed to the first Portuguese who arrived in India. It was the fault of those who persisted in the error after the knowledge of things in the East had made known to them the ideal place to this purpose, Ceylon. The result of all this was now in sight. The Portuguese state of India was very fragile and in danger of being lost. The Dutch seized many territories, blocked trade between India and China in the Strait of Malacca, and settled in Formosa, Taiwan, arming Macau traders in their relationship with China and Japan. Thanks to this, he warns, Macau was in great danger, and Ceylon was about to be lost permanently. But there was still hope. In 1641, Portugal and the Netherlands had signed a 10-year truce, which forced the Dutch to halt the ongoing process of conquest of Ceylon. Portugal had to do something urgently. The viceroy should immediately move to Ceylon and bet everything on maintaining the territory through a set of measures he proposes, but which lack of time does not allow for analysis here. But uh, if this was not enough for the Portuguese state of India to survive, in that case, the last possible solution would have to be put forward, which would include Macau and China. To this end, the first measure to be taken would be to send urgently an embassy to China in order to obtain authorization for the Portuguese in Macau to trade freely in the imperial territory. The idea would be to take advantage of the favorable occasion when the power of the Ming Emperor was weakened by the revolt of the Manchus and could thus look favorably on Portuguese help. Another important measure would be to authorize the Spanish, Dutch, and English to go to Macau to trade. This proposal may seem strange, but if the sale of China's goods were centralized in Macau, not only would the profits be much higher, but also the European competitors would be forced to come and buy a good part of the products in this territory, submitting to new rules. Pinto de Azevedo even defended the possibility of signing a commercial agreement with the Dutch, in which the Portuguese from Macau would supply the goods and the Dutch would transport them to Japan. As for the Spanish of the Philippines, the commercial relationship with them was also fundamental for obtaining silver, which was vital for the region's trade. But if the Chinese emperor did not receive the embassy or did not accede to its objectives, then the solution would have to be, according to the author, the conquest of Canton. I will not describe it here as there is no time for it, but Pinto de Azevedo presents an absolutely unbelievable plan for taking Canton. Even acknowledging that this proposal may seem to call into question the seriousness of his arbitrio, the author reaffirms his conviction that such a project is possible and desirable. We do not know if this text reached the hands of the king or his ministers. However, if it did, it is natural that the more utopian contents of it have contributed to discredit the arbitrio, which seemed to have no influence on the decisions that were taken regarding the Portuguese state of India in the years that followed. As for Hernando de los Rios Coronel, we are dealing with one of the well-known Spanish arbitrists for whom Governor Luis Pérez das Marinhas had great admiration. Priest, geographer, man of science, he was Attorney General of the Philippines at the Court of Madrid. In the three memorials he addressed to the monarch, which we mentioned above, he defended the maintenance of the Filipino archipelago, criticizing those who, at court, proposed its abandonment. The detractors of the Philippines at the royal court claimed, among other things, that the archipelago was a huge expense, not only because the distance from the metropolis was great, without providing much benefit, but also because it absorbed the American silver to China and brought demographic pressure on Spain. Accusing these advisors of not knowing the reality, Rios Coronel counter-argued that leaving the Philippines would aggravate enormous problems that Spain already had, as the Dutch would immediately take possession of it, which would jeopardize the Portuguese territories located in the Far East and Spanish America itself. On the other hand, if until now Spain had not benefited from the wealth of the Philippines, it was because of the incompetence of the respective governors who not only tried to apply the methods used in Europe on the islands, but they also entered into corruption schemes that benefited their own pockets, as well as those of their families and friends. And he adds that in his 30 years of connection with the Philippines, only one governor had performed positively, Gomes Pérez das Marinhas, deploring the fact that none of them had been punished and that low quality people continued to be appointed to a position of such importance. On the other hand, he said, the silver that came on the Acapulco galleon, despite arriving in excessive quantities in the Philippines, did not exactly harm the royal state as the custom duties it paid were higher than those charged for the silver that went to Seville. Likewise, the silver that arrived in Manila went into the hands of friendly states, while that which arrived in Spain ended up, through trade, enriching their own enemies. On the issue of demographic pressure on Spain, Rios Coronel develops the argument, claiming that the number of men who arrived annually in the Philippines never exceeded 200. If that were a reason to leave the Philippines, then Flanders and Italy would also have to be abandoned, because, he said, more men were consumed there in a single year than in the Philippines in 20 years. In addition, there was evidence that the Philippines had gold and silver mines in a mountainous region near Pangasinan. Its exploration could make the archipelago the best of all the Spanish overseas territory. Uh, Finally, Rios Coronel argues that leaving the Philippines would be to undermine the process of evangelization that was underway in the region. How would the conscience of a Catholic king like the Spaniard be if he chose to develop this purpose? There would be much more to highlight from the ideas exposed by these two arbitrists. Both invoke their experience in the Asian world to lend credibility to their arguments. Both criticize the mistakes made by the authorities of their states in the Asia, which led to the growth of Dutch power, the corruption that was raging throughout the civil service chain and beyond, the disregard for the law, and the lack of strategic vision that was fundamental for defend the interests of the crown. Therefore, both appeal to the respective monarchs to listen to them and implement the measures they propose, which they considered adequate to reverse the diagnosed problems. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation from Eduardo Frutoso. Let us now listen to the next presentation by Senora Maria Dolores Elizalde.
First of all, I would like to thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to participate in this conference, even if today I cannot be with you. But at least I send you my contribution on the Conejo de Filipinas, give voice to those who do not have it. The first decades of the 19th century were marked by the Cortes of Cádiz and the Philippine participation in a national parliament, by the independence of the American republics that had been part of the Hispanic monarchy, and by the decisions to refer the overseas provinces that represented the last remnants of the empire to special laws that differentiated them from the rest of the nation territory and transformed them into colonies with reduced rights. Those circumstances, together with the frequent change of government experienced in the peninsula at that time, led to a period of instability and unrest in the Philippines, where the colonial regime was increasingly contested. All of this also happened in an international context of imperialist expansion in which Western powers occupied new positions in Asia and the Pacific. Under these conditions, the Spanish metropolitan government was aware that if he wanted to maintain its sovereignty over the Philippines, he would have to introduce reforms that modernize the government of the islands. After several failed attempts to introduce reforms that did not come to fruition, the Spanish government decided to create a council of experts with people who knew the islands well and could advise on the reforms that should be implemented in the Philippines. In such a way, on December 1870, a decree created an advisory body known as the Council of the Philippines within the Ministry of Overseas. It should constitute an element of continuity in the design of the policies aimed at the Philippines and should be independent of the ministry or governing party. By law, the Council had to assess every decree, order, and regulation that the government wished to introduce in the islands. No such document could be legally approved without going through the Council first and considering its opinion. And although the Council assessment was not legally binding, the Ministry and the government usually followed its recommendations. In the same decree, the government expressed that the Council should become in some way a representative of the Philippine country, and in one of its first reports, the Council itself declared that it sought to be a genuine representative of the archipelago interest. Even the Minister of Overseas, Segismundo Moret, manifested his aspiration that the Council, integral in the design of the policies that the Spanish government will apply in the archipelago, will allow the voices of the Philippine subjects who had no representatives in the Cortes at that time to be heard. Initially, the council was composed by 6 councillors. The Spanish government appointed 4 of these councillors who were to come from any of the different entities of the state's central administration, as well as the army, the navy, and the judiciary. In addition, 2 other councillors who had to represent the island society will be appointed by the colonial government of the Philippines from a list of candidates that will be presented by the Manila City Council. Initially, there were no representatives of the powerful religious order that operated in the Philippines. On 1870, during the First Spanish Republic, the Spanish government feared that the religious would not support the reforms, especially since it will be probably necessary to rethink the role that the missionaries had traditionally played in the archipelago's government. However, the Cavite Mutiny that broke out in January 1872 modified the reformist impetus and alarmed the colonial authorities, which recommended the revision of the policies pursued by the metropolitan government since 1868, the time of the revolution in Spain. To avoid future uprising against Spanish rule, they argued it was necessary to adopt a more prudent attitude and reinforce mechanisms of social control, and the religious order spread out across the archipelago were instrumental in this regard. Consequently, a decree of March 1872 reformed the composition of the Council by adding two representatives of the Philippines regular and secular clergy. The expansion of the Council also included a permanent representative of the Treasury, for there was a great interest in addressing the archipelago's dismal financial situation. The Council members were quite stable, and replacement took place only when a councillor died or his health failed, or when his professional employment took him to another destination. In the 1870s, only 20 different men belonged to the Council. Most of the Council's reports were emitted after a royal order asked the Council to assess a reform that the metropolitan government was contemplating for the Filipino archipelago. But there were also instances in which the Council assesses initiatives and proposals submitted by the colonial government or authorities in the Philippines, and even by individuals. The Council also made recommendations regarding problems that emerged in the islands and that required the adoption of urgent measures. Once a request or document arrived at the Council, an ad hoc commission was formed, and its members studied the documents remitted to it and elaborated an opinion that was then read, debated, and endorsed in a plenary meeting. A resolution, a dictamen, was written up and sent to the Ministry of Overseas. I have grouped under the diverse uses that the Council has addressed throughout the 1870s in the following headings. As we have limited time, in this conference I will only develop the chapter devoted to forest, communal fields, and land tenure. A recurring subject of the Council in 1870s was the use of communal land and the harvesting of forests and timber. Traditionally, municipalities and communities has dealt with this very flexibly, according to customary uses based on the leyes de Indias. However, the modernization that accompanied the second half of the 19th century clashed with this practice, and the authorities felt the need to regulate land property and use rights. The problem arose when the General Forestry Inspection, la Inspección General de Montes, created in 1873, in accordance with what other countries were doing, measured and registered lands and forests in order to protect them and regulate their use. These modernizing measures clashed with customary uses and caused a great alarm in the islands, leading the Council to recommend flexibility in their applications, careful vigilance over bad practices, and a mode of conservation that respected Philippine customs. The Council underlined that it was necessary to avoid internal problems that could threaten the colonial regime. The Minister of Overseas asked the Council advice regarding the definition of communal fields, legua comunal in Spanish, and the rights of Filipinos regarding forest and land use. The Council resolution reminded the Ministry that the Leyes de Indias made no reference to communal fields, but instructed colonial authorities to reserve an extension of land for the pueblos de indios, which the natives were to use without interference, without determining a specific extension for this land. These same laws granted natives the faculty to harvest the timber that they needed, without any limitation other than they shall not do it in such a way that they impede the forest growth and expansion. The Council was thus alarmed by the reform that the Inspección de Montes hoped to carry out, for it will hurt a centuries-old custom, producing discontent in the great mass of the native population during one of the most turbulent periods in Spain's rule over the Philippines. For one thing, Spanish laws were not clear regarding the extension of the so-called communal fields. On the other hand, the native custom in the Philippines was to make use of all land and all the forests one had access to, and since there was no property registry, it will be very difficult for any community to justify its domain even over the lands that it traditionally cultivated. These issues had not been a problem before, because the island's natives could work the land according to the customs and decisions made in their own communities, without there being any question as to who owned the land and without the laws limiting such habits. The problems arose in the 19th century, when progress determined that all land should be registered, and when Spanish and foreign citizens asked for permissions to cultivate or to establish business or industries in lands regarded as empty. When these individuals tried to register these concessions, many pueblos claimed their century-old property of these lands. The Council knew that the lack of clarity in such an important matter as land tenure was a severe handicap for the progress of the islands, but it noted that it must be kept in mind that progress was in direct relation with people's tranquility and peace. The authorities would be unable to reach their object by force, and proposed that the matter be resolved with the collaboration of the gobernadorcillos, so that the solution should be acceptable to all parts involved. Under these circumstances, and in the interest of the archipelago's tranquility, the Council recommended not to steer away from the principles of moderation that have always guided the colonial authorities regarding native lands tenure. Understanding that it was necessary to institutionalize land tenure in accordance with the times, the Council proposed that provincial authorities, in collaboration with gobernadorcillos, should issue deeds that recognize the property of the lands for the arms that have made it fertile. Well, as conclusion, I have to say that I have chosen this subject because sometimes through the Council resolutions one can make a different image richer and deeper of what and how was the Spanish administration in the Philippines. Throughout the 1870s, the analysis of the opinions and discussions of the Council of the Philippines reveals the Spanish government's strong commitment to the introduction of reforms that will modernize the Philippine governing structures and administration and encourage the country's economic development. The Spanish government tried to reform the institution and structure of the Philippine government to resolve the archipelago's economic problems and procure its development, to encourage education, healthcare, and public works, and to improve infrastructure, housing, and urbanism. There was then an evident desire to improve, reform, and modernize the colony, and important measures and projects were considered and adopted in that regard. But at the same time, clear limits were also in place. The very concept of colonization, of what Spanish sovereignty over the Philippines entitled, and of what role Philippine subjects should play, limited the reach of efforts to secure modernizing reforms. The Council sought to ensure that the reforms conformed to a spirit of justice, that's it, that Filipinos were treated fairly and benefited in some way. They also underlined the need to avoid provoking problems and disturbance, even if that meant limiting the government's action. But it was clear that the continuation of Spanish sovereignty was over any reform. The population progress must be procured without introducing ideas or carrying out actions that could boost pro-independence desires of movements. A colonial mentality was then always present. Many of the measures recommended for adoption and many of the reforms that were rejected because they were regarded as inapplicable in the archipelago reveal the Council's members that the Council's members were convinced that an unbridgeable inequality separated peninsular Spaniards from Filipinos. Beyond the protection of certain practice upheld by the natives, the members of the Conejo de Filipinas, as well as the metropolitan and colonial authorities, continued to differentiate between the groups that peopled the archipelago, relegating those born in the Philippines as and especially natives and mestizos populations to a conveniently defined secondary plane. Despite their knowledge that without the collaboration and participation of Filipinos, it would have been impossible to develop countless policies and enterprise, the belief that the different groups that inhabited the Philippines were unequal led to relegations of Filipinos in many fields and limited prerogatives. There was no modernization in the mentality of colonizers, in their regards for the Philippine population, nor in their concept of Spanish colonialism. These important factors weighted on the disposition of those who were promoting reforms and modernizing policies in the islands, and limited their reach and capacity to act. Thank you. That's all. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Senora Elizalde, for that presentation. We thank her for her presentation. And finally, we listen to Leia Castaneda for her presentation. Okay, thank you.
Hi, warm greetings to everybody from the Carolina Piedmont. Before I begin, I wanted to thank the Ateneo de Manila and all the organizers for hosting such a comprehensive commemoration of this momentous anniversary, which also happens to double as a homecoming, virtual homecoming for this proud alumna. And since I'm not a Hispanicist, I'm really happy and grateful to be included in this conversation and eager to learn from you while exploring some issues surrounding the Philippines' transition from its Spanish to the American period that I was unable to tackle in my research into the constitutional history of the American colonial period. So what spurred this inquiry was a seemingly intuitive, almost obvious statement in Frank Gollay's magisterial book, Face of Empire. When he was writing about American colonial state building, he observed that although Americans were supremely confident of the altruism of their enterprise and the superiority of their political institutions and policies, he nonetheless, quote, found no occasion to revolutionize the colonial government inherited from Spain, close quote. This comment struck me because the safeguards that the American founders had incorporated into the US Constitution were primarily structural rather than substantive, and this was deliberate. Post-revolutionary era state politics had convinced James Madison that bills of rights were just mere parchment barriers that were useless against the leveling or redistributive impulses of legislative majorities, and therefore inferior and superfluous to what he called the mechanical contrivances that he and his fellow framers devised for the US Constitution. It was only, in fact, after some states conditioned the ratification on the inclusion of a Bill of Rights that Congress added one as the Constitution's first 10 amendments. To check the irony, the framers instead placed their faith in two structural features that define the relationships among the different branches and levels of the new national government, namely separation of powers and federalism. So as you know, separation of powers functionally distributed authority among the federal government's executive, legislative, and judicial branches. And federalism carved out areas subject to federal jurisdiction and reserved residual authority to the states. But when the US made its imperial decision, proponents tried to align her colonialism with her constitutional democracy by tempering the former's tyrannical potential, but mainly with substantive or doctrinal safeguards. So the Bill of Rights, or more precisely, natural rights expressed in the Charter, appeared prominently in foundational imperial texts like first, the Senate ratification debates over the 1898 Treaty of Paris, ceding Spain's insular possessions to the United States. Second, the Philippine Organic Acts like McKinley's instructions to the Second Philippine Commission, the 1902 Organic Act, and the 1916 Jones Law. And third, the insular cases, by which the US Supreme Court defined the constitutional relationship between the US and the new category called unincorporated territories, into which Puerto Rico and the Philippine Islands had been classified. By contrast, one structural safeguard, separation of powers, was extended but by implication, meaning it could be inferred from references in McKinley's instructions to certain principles or some practical rules of government found essential to preserving liberty and law, as well as derived from the interdepartmental division of functions in the Organic Act and the Jones Law. But how would principles devised to regulate relationships within a particular institutional terrain operate against a different grid? Because for all the priority that the framers assigned to structure, American colonial policymakers were willing to adapt Spanish remnants to their colonial project. So Dean Worcester explained to his Filipino and foreign interviewees that the Sherman Commission wanted to, quote, make use as far as possible of all the good features of the old system, close quote. So he must have welcomed Cayetano Arellano's assessment that the Spanish government system was good, but that the officials were bad, because then all it would take was a personnel change, right? But to figure out how American legal rules worked within a Spanish infrastructure, we need first to identify what these structural continuities were. And they seem most apparent in three areas: local government, the administrative bureaucracy, and the nature and character of the executive branch. Taken together, I suggest that Spanish continuities, along with American modifications, centralized authority in the Governor General and fortified his position in colonial politics. Perhaps the clearest institutional carryover from the Spanish period was local government. These units played a special role in a colonial program that was justified as constitutional and democratic by training Filipinos for self-governance under the rule of law. If the yeoman farmer embodied the iconic citizen in American political mythology, then town government was its institutional counterpart, the paradigm map incubator for self-rule. Interestingly, however, Americans didn't use any homegrown templates, not the New England Township, the Southern County, or their Western hybrid. Instead, the plan prepared by a board constituted by the first US military governor, Major General Otis, drew heavily on the Spanish Maura law. Initially enforced by military orders, this plan informed the municipal and provincial government codes subsequently enacted by the Philippine Commission. Promulgated by decree in 1893, the Maura Law represented the culmination of efforts in Spain to institute a more liberal colonial government system, but its execution in the islands was suspended, so its reforms never really took root. But despite being dead letter under Spain, basic elements survived under American rule, notably innovations like the creation of municipal tribunals and provincial councils to assist local chief executives and governments, which the Americans kept. So just as Spanish provincial officials had closely inspected the work of unchartered municipal governments, so did three-man provincial boards under US rule supervise chartered municipal corporations, with the key officer in the early years being the treasurer, who was usually an American. The Maura Law also enlarged the voter base by adding taxpayers to prior office holders, and the Americans further broadened the franchise. Under the US, however, the nature of the franchise changed. Filipinos now voted to select the representatives rather than merely recommend potential appointees to office. Plus, office holding was expanded since they could now run for positions higher than municipal captain in the regular provinces. More significantly, Americans preserved Spanish-era local and central relations. Under Spain, local government, at least towards the end of it, was overseen by the Directorate General of Civil Administration, which is a subdivision of a branch called Gobernación y Fomento, which fell under the Spanish Governor General. The US took over this directorate and later assigned local government oversight to the Executive Bureau, an office that was under the American Governor General during the Taft era, but was later transferred to the Department of Interior after the Jones Law. Under Spain as well, central government agencies exerted local control through their representatives in local units. And Americans also preserved that command structure. They also had representatives from the bureaus of health and all that on the local level. These centralizing Spanish carryovers facilitated the tutelage in democracy, but deprived Filipinos of a more robust experience in self-governance that perhaps an American town model might have afforded them. Moreover, I argue, and this is like counterfactual, but they removed an important mechanism by which the US system might have checked power at the center, which was federalism. The division between the federal government's enumerated powers and the state's residual ones has historically produced a great deal of institutional competition. But since the islands were an unincorporated territory not destined for statehood, they stood outside this federal relationship and the US Constitution, which meant that in places outside the Union, like the islands, the federal government's power was organic and plenary. So it merged what was given to the federal and the state governments. So it brooked no interference from the states. More important, the insular or Philippine colonial government, as the federal government's agent, partook in its principles' vast authority. So retaining in it Spanish-style structural authority over local governments eliminated these units as a source of institutional competition. And with this, the possibility that they might have curbed power at the center. Americans also commandeered the Spanish colonial administrative machinery and upcycled it for their purposes. At the American conquest, the Spanish bureaucracy was heading towards cleaner delineation and greater efficiency, including the splitting of executive from judicial functions. But it remained sprawling and complex. And this was partly because its mode of mutual oversight was to create personal competition among members of multiple advisory bodies with redundant and overlapping functions. So that's everything in yellow. US military officers took over Spanish government offices and revived their work while reorganizing the bureaus, and civil authorities continued this streamlining process and eliminated redundant roles. The result was an insular bureaucracy that departed from its messier and more rudimentary US mainland counterparts, like state governments, which had a lot of ad hoc bureaus, and a 19th century federal government that was called a patchwork state, or a state of courts and parties, since it was a loose organization whose operations were coordinated by political parties and whose prerogatives and interactions were demarcated by common law courts. Streamlining the Spanish command structure made it more directly accountable to the American Governor General. When Act 222 organized the insular government into 4 departments, it subjected the secretary's exercise of executive control over its bureaus to the Governor General's general supervision. So that meant he had direct executive control over both central and local government units. Again, this setup was more Spanish than it was American, since state governors were not the executive heads of their administrations. Authority was spread out among other state officers who were also elective, and commission and board heads. And the US president at this time was merely the nominal head of the administration, who had, in the words of Stephen Skoronek, had never risen beyond the status of a clerk, since he was a party politician beholden to local district representatives for political support. The insular government also inherited its predecessor's capacity for intervention. The Spanish colonial government had closely regulated the galleon trade, created government monopolies, provided social services like hospitals and orphanages. This, at least the ability to do this, made it an ideal vehicle for realizing American colonialism's civilizing mandate. For progressive colonial policymakers like President Theodore Roosevelt, Secretary of War Elihu Root, and Governor General William Howard Taft, civilization was translated as a development project. So preparing Filipinos for self-rule meant not just enlisting them to run the government, but using social engineering to modernize their primitive minds, bodies, habits, and the places around them to create both civilized native capacity plus the material basis to support democratic politics. That the islands became a laboratory for progressive policy experiments set it apart once again from US analogs, since it was more of a New Deal rather than a night watchman state. Constitutionally, the insular government's civilizing agenda was validated by a conception of police power that was based in a sovereignty that was not popular, since the Filipino people were not sovereign, but rather statist, since it was inherent in Congress and delegated to the insular government. Moreover, its programs were insulated from judicial review by an emerging administrative law that was deferential to administrative expertise. So turning now to the executive branch. The American departmental design was not immediately realized in the islands, but was achieved progressively over 3 stages. American separation of powers theory had no direct Spanish equivalent, since Spain, recall earlier, had checked abuse through personal competition among officials with shared duties, rather than institutional competition among officials with rival functions. Yet, American Governor General still resembled his Spanish precursor in his institutional superiority over the other 2 branches, with respect both to their internal dynamic and to their relationship to the colonial sovereign. At conquest, the military governor exercised his commander-in-chief's absolute and supreme authority that merged all 3 functions, and perhaps this was akin to what Spain conferred at conquest on its adelantados. But this was temporary, so functions were spun off from the executive, making the central government's structural evolution in reality a devolution of powers from the executive. So the Governor General relinquished judicial power when the courts were reactivated in August 1898, then gradually ceded legislative power to Filipinos following the British North American model, colonial model that assigned the popular branch to colonists and the magisterial, judicial, and executive branches to representatives of the sovereign. So Filipinos gained first minority membership in the Executive Legislative Philippine Commission in September 1901, then control of the lower house in 1907, and the entire legislature in 1916. But what was not devolved was retained by the executive. And what was yielded was offset by reserving checks for the executive, like line item veto power and automatic appropriations. Thus, devolution did not mean diminution. This unbalanced power distribution had consequences for transplanting separation of powers jurisprudence. Where authority was dispersed, as in the US, the separate spheres approach kept each player within his assigned boundaries and prevented aggrandizement by any one of them. But against a lopsided insular grid, deferential doctrines enhance executive power by preventing the other two branches from encroaching on his concentrated prerogative. So it just the separation of powers approach will just reproduce the imbalance that was already in the design. So, and on top of shielding the Governor General's assigned powers from judicial review, the Philippine Supreme Court also protected those that were inherent in his office. For just as the Spanish Governor General had represented the Spanish king's absolute monarchy, the court viewed the American Governor General as the personal embodiment of US sovereignty in the islands, which was also inherent and absolute. So there was a theoretical continuity in the executive's relationship to the sovereign. This structure steered colonial politics towards interesting routes. Basically, Filipino leaders tried to expand their role in governance by loosening the executive's grip over the administration. Confined to the legislature, their strategies were mainly legislative. So as the lower house, they wielded the traditional power of the purse to lower the salaries of Americans in government and also to block the Philippine Commission's budget. As the legislature, they reorganized the bureaucracy to channel control over the administration to the Filipino department secretaries, and then they made the secretaries accountable to the legislature. And they also invaded the executive branch through hybrid executive legislative bodies like the Council of State and the Board of Control to run the government and its corporations. So these devices that the Filipino leaders used to weaken the grip of the Governor General was actually, I guess, had analogs in the Spanish period because they were reminiscent of the councils that advised the Governor General and also the councils that tried to vet the orders of the Philippine president under the stillborn Malolos Constitution. So the Americans may not have adapted anything at this point, but I guess the Filipinos in their strategies against the Governor General did. Unfortunately, most of their maneuvers were either thwarted by reserve checks or deemed unconstitutional. Taking a broader view, my sense is that the transplanted US system didn't have the right tools to check executive power because its safeguards were essentially anti-legislative strategies designed to curb majoritarian despotism in an American regime that had historically identified the legislature with the people and regarded it as the supreme branch in its popular sovereign tradition. Against this background assumption of legislative supremacy, checks against what Madison called the impetuous legislative vortex did not target the real vortex of power in the islands. This came in the form of a chief executive whose capacities were in part constructed out of Spanish remnants and who had personified an absolutist conception of sovereignty originally through Spain's absolute monarchy and later the US's organic sovereignty. Validated by American constitutional discourse, the chief executive's institutional and theoretical supremacy over all levels and branches of a machinery of state that was empowered to regulate all manner of activity in the islands made him a constitutional autocrat. Preserved in essence by the 35 Constitution with some modifications in the 87 Charter, this configuration equipped the Philippine president with vast ability, authority, and energy for discretionary action, along with, as we've seen play out repeatedly, tremendous potential for their abuse. Thank you and good evening.
Okay, thank you very much for that very impressive presentation, Leia.
Thank you.
Very nice, very nice. Okay, we now move on to the open forum. So let's do it this way. Since Leia is here with us, let's prioritize first, or let's get questions, comments, clarifications, or if you want to share your thoughts on Leia's presentation, let us have them. And
Oh dear, did we get an interruption? Is Roy? Okay. I'm so sorry. I think there's an internet interruption for Roy. So while we're waiting for Roy to get back to us, while our first two speakers only were able to send their recording, there has been an asynchronous exchange of questions and answers. Dr. Ruth Deliobe, who was also studying Arbitrismo, was very excited to listen to Eduardo Frutoso, who couldn't join us, but we did send her a copy of the presentation, and she had a question to ask, which was answered by Eduardo Frutoso. Dave, did we decide which of the questions we will share? I can share my screen. And meanwhile, we invite the audience, please use the chat box. And in the Zoom room, raise your hand if you would want to jump in to do our Q&A with Leia. But while we're waiting for Roy to get back and for chat questions to be gathered, I was hoping to share with you some of the questions that were asked. I'll just ask help from Dave to pick which questions we will read for our audience.
Let's first read the first question that was sent to us.
And answer.
Would you like to be? I'll read the question, Nikki, and would you like to be the one to read the response?
Okay, thank you. Sure, Dave.
Okay. The first question that was sent to us goes like this: Arbitrios are not generally written for fun, but with a target intended. What were the political and socio-economic motivations behind the writing of the documents mentioned in the talk?
So this was the answer sent in to us by Eduardo Frutoso. Unfortunately, the timing was not good. It's exam period in their side of the world, and he's required to be there. So here's his answer. In fact, arbitrios are not documents written for fun. It is true that the concept of arbitrismo is often associated, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, with fanciful utopian proposals which should not be taken seriously, produced by individuals who intended to get favors from the king in exchange for his advice. However, many of the arbitrios were serious texts written by people who were absolutely convinced that they were doing their nation a service with them. And they had, of course, very concrete goals. In the case of the authors presented, George Pinto de Azevedo argues that Portugal must regain control of the most important maritime routes in the East so that the Portuguese state of India can survive. The strengthening of the Dutch position in the Orient was facilitated by a series of strategic mistakes made by the Portuguese, which, if not quickly reversed, could lead to the fall of the Portuguese Empire. From the outset, the first big mistake was having established the seat of their power in Goa, when the best place for that purpose would have been Ceylon. This caused enormous costs in political and socio-economic terms that were reflected in Portugal's difficulties in maintaining its trade routes and the solidity of its maritime empire. Therefore, says Pinto de Azevedo, Portugal must strengthen its commercial position in the Pacific, guaranteeing the survival of Macau and exclusive trade with China. In the end, while living in Macau at the time he was writing, Pinto de Azevedo puts in this text the thought that should have been common at the time among Macanese merchants. Should I stop there for now, David?
Yes, Nikki, let's check first if Roy has rejoined the Zoom room.
Okay, maybe we have room for another question for the presentation of Eduardo Frutoso. Meanwhile, we also have a whole team behind us. Chas Navarro and Noel Rodriguez are also collating questions from social media. And people in the Zoom room, we shall call you also for a discussion after we maybe another question. Dave, which question should we pick this time?
Let's go for the second one. Maybe we can do it reverse. You can ask the question this time and I'll be the one to read it.
So Ruth Deliobe had this question. Could you please explain more about Pinto de Azevedo? Was he writing from Asia or from Portugal?
The answer that was given to us goes like this. Pinto de Azevedo wrote his text in 1646 when he was residing in Macau. He will have arrived in India coming from Portugal in 1622, as he refers in his text that he had been walking around the Orient for 24 years. He claims that he will have been, certainly with some exaggeration, in every city, fortress, or kingdom of India, from Mozambique to Japan, particularly in the coastal regions of the peninsula of Malaysia and the Far East. He also mentions that he made all these trips in the service of the Portuguese state as a soldier and captain, but also doing trade on his own, something that was very common among Portuguese soldiers arriving in Goa. At a certain point in his texts, he states that he never lived anywhere in the Orient for more than 2 years in a row, which suggests that he would have been in Macau in 1646, but not long ago. This experience of his life in contact with Asia is the reason he invokes to write this Arbitrio, whose interest lies not only in the fact that he is a merchant who defends the Portuguese political and commercial domain in the area of the Indian Pacific Ocean, but also in the circumstance that his ideas reflected a very common current of opinion among the Portuguese who lived in Macau at that time.
All right. Thank you, Dave. I think Roy is back. Hello, Roy. I think you're muted. Oh, Roy, you're muted. We have to unmute you first.
Well, I'm sorry, I got disconnected. The vicissitudes of online presentations and online learning. But anyway, I'm here again. I read in the chat box, Kuwa would like to give his thoughts on one of the presentations. So may we call on Kuwa to comment about an earlier presentation. Yeah, please, Mr. Kuwa.
Hi. I would like also to talk a little bit about the arbitrism. I think the two answers of Dr. Frutoso are quite enlightening, very clear about the importance of these documents, these discourse narratives, documents that were sent to the Crown in order to improve certain policies, to propose policies. And there are many. My intention is, I think it's important to see the historical context, the specific moment, and a reality that is imposing in the way in which people, bishops, traders, officials wrote these documents to suggest policies. Basically, there were two elements. The geopolitical, we use now the word geopolitical situation, in which the Spanish Empire and then the Crown of Spain and Portugal together had to deal with this vast extensive territory. So this is a must to understand the arbitrism during that time. A second element that is political and in some ways also about the economic framework and the conceptual concept of economics is related to the presence since the 1600s of the Dutch and the British, the English, that were entering into Southeast Asia. And they brought with them the concept of these companies, share companies, that like the VOC, that were private in a sense, but politically dominated by the enemies of Spain. So this economic stance was very important to consider which kind of policies Spain and in some moment Portugal need to follow to respond to these adversaries in economic, military, and political terms. So this is the framework, I think, in which we can understand this kind of proposals. And just simply to enumerate some is Duarte Gómez Solís, Diego de Duarte, that proposed to abandon Macau in one point, Bishop João Ribeiro Gallo in 1595, that proposed also to change the viceroyalty of Portugal into Goa, and Pedro de Avendaño, that proposed to exchange Brazil for the Philippines. That in 1608, simply trade the power of Philippines to the Portuguese and save the problems. Thank you.
Roy, just to update you, there are 2 hands raised in the Zoom room and there are 2 questions lined up on YouTube. Okay. Could we call Father Tony and then Greg Bancroft from the Zoom room? Father Tony, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Again, thank you as well to our speakers. It is unfortunate that Senor Frutoso and Dr. Elizalde could not join us. But let me begin by, it's actually some kind of observation and then maybe a question a little later. I had a discussion when Father Jack Schumacher was still alive, and in the course of our conversation, he made a comment about how in Spain, there was no kind of modernization model, as it were, that was not anti-clerical. So, and therefore, during the American period, as it were, there was certainly the rhetoric of how everything that happened before in the Spanish period was really, you might say, something that belonged to the Dark Ages. There was that kind of a rhetorical painting, as it were, of the Spanish period. So this is the reason why I think in some ways the talks of Dr. Elizalde and Dr. Leia Castaneda kind of, I think their talks trouble these rather easy characterizations. First of all, I think Dr. Elizalde, if she were around, I would have wanted to ask her who were these 10 people who made up the Conejo de Filipinas, and what exactly was their relationship, let's say, to the role, let's say, that the Catholic Church played in Philippine society in the 19th century. Because this is a question that keeps on coming up, right? The Patronato Real, which was a historically contingent decision, nevertheless was held to be kind of almost eternal, no? The way certainly the religious orders understood it and the way the church understood it. And therefore, this was to hark back, as it were, to the 15th, late 15th, 16th centuries for an understanding of what the role of the church is in a colonial society like the Philippines. And an interesting thing precisely here was that the church was being persecuted in Spain and its properties being confiscated here and there, and yet the decision, the continuity, as it were, of colonial policy to use the church in order to make sure that the Philippines would remain tied to Spain. So, so this thing about the Consejo de Filipinas, what kind of attitudes did the people who made it up? I think she said at some point in her talk that representatives from the religious orders were incorporated into the Consejo de Indias. No, so this is one question that I would have wanted to ask Dr. Elizalde. But turning to Dr. Leia Castaneda, it's an interesting thing to note that the tensions, or sometimes the contradiction that is used to paint Hispanization and Americanization, is not as simplistic and as clear-cut as we are sometimes made to understand. And therefore, I think her talk really tries to show a certain continuity of certain structures, maybe of certain or substantial things. And it would seem that we are very much ignorant, for example, about the history of the law in this transition from the Spanish to the American colonial regimes. No? So I really appreciate, I think, Dr. Castaneda's talk, because it brings up, it opens out, as it were, new areas that we can look into for research, and therefore perhaps lawyers in particular could help us out in delineating this history. The question I would want to ask her is something about the language of the law, and I think Spanish continued to be used for quite a long time during the American colonial regime, the first decade or so, and if she has any thoughts about that, the use of the Spanish language, and then second, the jury system, as it were. So taking a closer look at the judicial system itself. And maybe there's something here that evolved quite differently. So that would be my question to her.
Thank you, Father, for your comments and your questions. I'm not sure what you mean exactly, though, about thoughts about the language of the law. I think that the official policy was supposed to be until 1909, but then I think they kept, because it took some time, to learn English. It took. I think the debates, even in the assembly and the legislatures, correspondences with government officials were still conducted in Spanish. But I didn't really think that was such a hindrance for maybe the Filipinos to learn American constitutional rules as well as the institutions, because when Sergio Osmeña was the speaker, for instance, he was so attuned to, I guess, the role of the resident commissioner, and he was able to draw on U.S. histories, just the debates, to justify why the assembly had the right to appoint both resident commissioners rather than sharing one with the commission. So, I mean, and at that time, I think his secretary was Teodoro Calao, and I know he wrote a lot in Spanish too. So, to me, I guess it didn't strike me as a hindrance for them to be able to engage with the constitutional discourse of the Americans. About the jury system, that wasn't really one of the provisions of the Bill of Rights that was, I guess, extended to the Philippines. And that's because technically it's not the text of the Bill of Rights of its own force did not apply in the islands. It was more that there were certain natural rights. So, and that was more of a procedural, they considered it a procedural feature of Anglo-American law. So that was not transferred over to the Philippines. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
No.
Okay, thank you very much. I saw the hand of Greg Bankoff. Professor Greg, you may want to ask your question now.
Yes, thank you. And my question is not entirely removed from Father Tony's as well, but and it's to Leia and to, well, it would have been to Dr. Elizalde. I mean, both of you are sort of talking about how government should work in principle at a very top-down level, but my research of the last 20 years has really been looking at how institutions work and agencies work at the local level in the Philippines. And that often is an entirely different way of our more practical way. So I'm ready to ask, and I totally agree, there's quite a lot of continuity from the Spanish to the American period. But I wondered whether the continuity of, how shall I put it, obedezco pero no cumplo, I obey, but I don't comply kind of ideas that characterize local level government actually carry over into the American period as well. In other words, there's a way things are meant to work, but do they really work like that at the grassroots level?
I guess my understanding of, obedezco pero no cumplo was that applied to laws that were passed in Spain, and then I guess the Governor General and his advisors had the discretion to suspend its application, right? Depending on local circumstances, is my understanding of that mechanism. Is that correct? But with the
so that's so I didn't mean to get into a discussion about obedesco pero no cumplo, but the idea of actually, you have a principle of how things should work, but actually what's the reality on the ground when it comes to actually what's practiced.
Well, I guess just drawing from the US period, I suppose, the extent of central control over the local government, I guess, was both statutory and I guess also in practice, because there was a lot of control placed in the treasurer, I guess, to vet expenses. And also, I think in terms of tax paying, the intent was, I think, that local taxes were supposed to be kept within the province. But I think the problem was that, I guess, and this is maybe one deviation, the intent was supposed to strengthen local autonomy and keeping more revenue on that level. But I guess they weren't able, the Americans were not able to pass an internal revenue code early on. So a lot more of the revenue from the local level went to the central government, so that enhanced central control even more. So I'm not sure. So I guess that would be a deviation from the plan. But admittedly, though, I do really focus more on how the mechanism is supposed to work, because I think it's just I guess just the limitations of where I am and all that stuff. So but yeah, I hope that kind of addresses it a little bit.
Again, I mean, it's just that if you had to characterize government agencies at the local level in the Philippines, I think one of the words I would use would be flexible.
Okay.
And I just, and I've seen that especially in early American institutions in the Philippines and agencies, that they are actually, I mean, they're on the ground, they're practical, they have to deal with the reality of what's going on. And it's simply not often the case that you can institute this kind of principled institutional organization that you're meant to be. And yeah, so I just curious what you thought about that.
Okay.
Roy, we have a lot of comments coming in from YouTube. I don't know how you will choose, but there's a lot. Oh, I think, is Roy, are you there?
Roy's frozen again, Nikki.
Okay, so if it's frozen, I'm gonna just pick the first one I see. This is from Palan Reyes, no? It's just sharing. I recall a story from Cayo Alzona, who at the turn of the century was among the Philippine lawyers who met with the American counterparts. The Americans knew no Spanish and the Filipinos no English. That's just a comment. Why did they retain US control of the executive and judicial branches, and how were moves by the Filipino legislatures to seize control by making local governance answerable to them rather than the executive? I don't know.
Sorry.
Yeah, why did they retain US control of the executive and judicial branches? And how were moves by the Filipino legislators to seize control by making local governance answerable to them rather than the executive?
That's a really interesting question, because I was really struck why would legislation be what was assigned to the colonials? And I really think it has something to do with Anglo-American history. In the British North American colonies, that's where the colonists were housed. So it's funny how that same model resurrected, but then with the Americans on the other side of it. So they called the executive and the judicial branches the magisterial branches. And most of the times these were fused anyways, because in the British North American models, I think the privy councils and all that were also advising the executive, and there were also judicial. So you needed the governor to be a representative of the sovereign, and often that included adjudicating powers. So the legislation would be the one that would be spun off to the people. And normally it had to do, from what I read, taxation did not initially form part of legislative powers. So the reason why the House of Commons was formed was because they had representatives from districts specifically go to give consent to taxation. So it's also tied into that. That's why you had to have the people consent to the raising of revenue. And I guess that just sort of carried over through history. What was the second part of the question? I missed it. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. The second part is, sorry. But Filipino legislators to seize control by making local governance answerable to them rather than the executive.
I'm sorry, I should have been clearer. It was not local government, but the central government agency. So because the Governor General controlled the department secretaries, what the Filipino legislators did was to pass, I think, the Reorganization Act first to make the department secretaries report to the legislature. And that's actually a move that's also in the Malolos Constitution, which I found fascinating. And then they gave the department secretaries control over the bureau. So they cut the Governor General off by a law. So they make the department secretaries in charge of the administration, and then they make the department secretaries answer to them. And then the second part of it, though, was that they invaded the cabinet. So with the Council of State and the Board of Control, actually, they're more like a super cabinet because they practically run the government on a day-to-day level because they approved hiring, firing, budget, that kind of thing for a bunch of agencies that fell under different administrations. And the people who sat on that were the Governor General, the Senate President, and the Speaker. The Board of Control was the corporate equivalent of the Council of State in that what they ran on a day-to-day level were the government companies. And the interesting thing is how they justified it. They said that because the legislature was the only directly elected branch of the entire insular government, then it would be consistent, I guess, with Americans' democratic tradition to hold the running of the government answerable to the people's directly elected representatives. The funny thing, though, is that it's a conflation of, I guess, popular representation and sovereignty, because in the Philippines, the legislature was popular but not sovereign. So that's the kind of, that meaning, there was really no necessity in a popular sovereign tradition to make the administration answerable to the legislature. I mean, that's how I guess the Americans should have answered that, but they didn't. But that was the justification for that mechanism. But what's really interesting is that mechanism isn't anywhere within, I guess, the US. It might have emerged later on as wartime emergency boards, kind of all these ad hoc things because of emergency, but that might have been a US analogy. But I think the closer one historically would be from the Spanish era.
Thank you. Roy, are you back?
Yes, I'm back again for the nth time. Okay, so thank you very much for that, for the answers. It's way past 8:30, and I'd really like to thank the panel.
Are you ending this now? Can we take a few more questions? Because there are so many. Chas and Noel, can you help pick? Are you
okay?
Are you okay to extend, Leia?
Okay.
Yes.
I like Father Tone.
Let's extend. Yeah, I thought we so sorry. Okay.
So are we still live?
Yes, we're still live because it's really the social media audience I want to entertain because they have so many questions. I'll just,
oh my God.
For example, from Catherine Tan, from your research, have you come across how law entrenched capitalism in the transition between Spanish to American colonialism?
I guess I don't understand what she meant by entrenched, but I guess that was part of Taft era economic policy. I guess what I kind of referred to it a little bit when I said that they used government to create the material basis for democracy, because they kind of came as a packaged political democracy with a market economy. And the thing is, though, as interventionist as they were in maybe ordering latrines to be built in people's houses, that kind of thing, invading individual rights, they were really more hands-off when it came to property. So in a sense, they tried to create a lot of incentive for private foreign capital to come in, but it was only maybe during the Harrison administration when, with the control that was gained by the Filipino legislators over the insular government, that they used revenue to charter this whole empire of government corporations that government got into business. So I guess in that sense, yeah, I mean, they created the conditions for a market economy is how I'd answer that.
Oh, Noel, meron pa ba from social media? I'm sorry, in English. Noel and Chas. Wait, because I'm
Can
scrolling.
I answer Father Tony's comment?
Yes, go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
he says that it would seem that the parliamentary form of government was in fact the format under which the Filipino Assembly wanted to operate. I totally agree. And it's, I'm not saying we should go there, but it seems like even in the Malolos Constitution, there were also many devices where there were these advisors surrounding the leader to kind of, I guess, vet his decisions. And the Philippine Commission initially from 1902 to the 1916 was also this sort of conciliar body that was executive and legislative. So there's a lot of cooperation, I guess. Maybe that's something that we look for. I'm not sure what the explanation is, but then even when separation of the functions became more clearer and more stark, there was that tendency to go back to that mode again. So it might be worth considering. I'm not sure, but it's just historically, it's very striking that the tendency keeps resurfacing. Yeah.
Chas?
Well, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, there was a comment earlier, and I don't know if it has been passed on. It was from Mr. Palan Reyes regarding a story from Cayo Alzona. Has that been mentioned already?
Yes, yes.
Okay. How about, there was this much earlier. It seems that the Americans passed laws to devolve power from the absolute executive and also to give Filipinos greater participation in self-governance. What was the motivation for these laws? Was there any particular trigger, or was it based primarily on a philosophical bent towards governance by the governed?
I think that it's a mix of motivations, but the large justification for the program that was pursued on the ground. I mean, the US was accountable to many constituencies, and a big one would be at home. And the whole imperial decision was a really fraught process because it kind of caused an identity crisis. Like, who are we really? If we're going to be a democracy, how could we possibly be an empire? So in this, and you can see this really tortured exchange in the Senate ratification debates. And the solution that they came up with, well, it's not really, there was a way to kind of tame imperialism to make it more congenial to their own traditions. So the solution that was suggested, I forgot his name, but anyway, one of the senators, Platt, I think, said something like, okay, it won't be tyrannical. I mean, in itself, imperialism doesn't have to be a bad thing. And we can tame it. And the way we're going to do it is with our own traditions. So one would be, we would extend natural rights. And the second would be that we will, be mindful of the consent of the governed. But of course, who was the governed? Who was the Filipino people? That was something that they, in a way, decided, right? The Americans, who would we work with here? And then it's usually people who gets to vote, right? People who can speak and write Spanish and English. That's not going to be a lot of people, right? So, but they were always mindful of that. And I actually think that if you look at the structures that were put in place, there was really a lot of control placed in the American controlled branches. So if they wanted to assert the full prerogatives of their office, it would have been easy. But of course, it would have prevented cooperation, collaboration, and that was the optics of that. I think cooperation stood for consent in a way. So if that broke down, that wouldn't have been well received by, on the ground. You say you're being a bunch of hypocrites, right? And it won't also be well received back home. So I think that in a way, the consensual tradition of the US kind of mitigated the heavy-handed exertion of power. Yeah. So, and I guess the other thing was that I think because the Philippines was ruled out, for being a state, the self-governance component had to be introduced because it was preparatory to becoming sovereign, right? To becoming its own nation. So but then the question is, how long does this program last? How long was this training going to last? And I think Taft era officials were thinking 3 generations. How many did we get? Maybe 2. But but I think the idea was that, I don't know if we could have stayed like Puerto Rico at the beginning. Puerto Rico was not, I think there was not a lot of resistance on the ground because they're still an unincorporated territory, right? But I think that's what we would have been if we didn't leave. But yeah, so I mean, that whole practice in self-governing could have lasted until now. But anyway, yeah. So I'm sorry, I hope that answers it.
Oh, well. Just the last one was this comment, and I think it's more or less connected with what you just said now. It said that, from Mr. Reyes, the transition from a Spanish judicial system to an American-based judicial system must have been messy. Okay, especially in the local level.
Yeah, I think that was one of the biggest things that that Americans had to reform. I think the structure was in place because they used the existing offices, Justice of the Peace. Then there was no Court of Appeals yet at that time. But they did have, I think, the courts of first instance and then straight to the Supreme Court. But even when the military was in charge, they already changed the procedural law. Because I think they found the Spanish system too inquisitorial, so they prefer their own adversarial system. So I think one of the earliest general orders were civil and criminal procedure. So yeah,
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's it from my end. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think we that's it. I think no more questions, clarifications, or what. Before I turn the floor to Nikki for further announcements, let me just thank the Department of History, our chair, Dave Losada, Chas Navarro for assisting and supporting us, and also to.
Oh dear. I think
Nikki, you have to go.
okay. So while he's frozen again, I would just like to take this moment to give a quick announcement about what's coming tomorrow and on Saturday. Tomorrow we have panel 12 on religious institutions. We have a back-to-back panel A and B. It's going to be 3 hours. It will be the Department of Theology's turn, and there will be 5 speakers, 2 from Lisbon, 2 from Manila, and Father Tony from Zamboanga. I hope you could join us. The usual time, 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. On Saturday, a special panel discussion organized by the Philippine Embassy in Portugal. From spices to startups, Philippine-Portuguese trade relations. The usual hour, 4 o'clock to 7, but it's going to be slightly different. The topics would include Mabuti sardines, investments in Portugal, and investments of the Portuguese in the Philippines, and of course, Web Summit. And the final panel for part 3 of the conference is on the city. And that will be on Tuesday, July 13 next week. We have a break Sunday and Monday from this epic conference. I hope you would continue to attend all these events or catch them on YouTube or on Facebook. If you miss the original time slot, everything is recorded and archived. So back to you, Roy. And if Roy is not here, I would just like to thank everybody on behalf of the organizers, Jonathan Chua, Paolo Pinto, Chas Navarro, Noel Rodriguez, and myself who are here. We would like to thank our partners, all the departments who have participated from Ateneo de Manila University, Sham Centro de Humanidades Universidad Nova de Lisboa, and the Quincentennial Committee Quincentennial Committee of the Philippines, our teams here in Zoom, on YouTube, and on Facebook. Leia Castaneda, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting
Thank
me.
you.
Thank you
Bye.
so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We just ended the live stream, but the Zoom can go on.
Leia, salamat. Wow.
Very impressive.
Yeah.
Very impressive. Very impressive.
Ganda, no?
Yeah, very nice. Very nice. Oh.
Leia, you're on mute. Yan.
Thank you. Oh my gosh.
Thank
I was
you.
kind of
Thank
worried
you,
na
everyone.
hindi naman